Hello. There was a time when the rich did not pay tax, although they lived in mansions while their workers lived in shacks. Back then the wise men said, as long as enterprise is free, the future will be full of great prosperity. The sick and unemployed would usually end up on the street, searching through the garbage for something to eat. In the age of the robber barons, there was a time when land was handed with both fists from the state right to the industrialists, who profited from war, who profited in peace, who profited from unregulated monopolies, unregulated factories, gargantuan cartels, run by men who knew you'd buy what they had to sell. In the age of the robber barons, there was a time when these barons held the strings that controlled the politicians who give them anything. There were no consequences, regardless of who died. Everybody knew the law was on their side. Never far when needed to defend the property of the Vanderbilts and Stanfords and all those who owned the country. In the age of the robber barons, there was a time when you could either swim or drown, a time when the whole country was one big company town, when the basic human rights were empty words considered by the barons as patently absurd. It was the age of laissez-faire, and sometimes I repine. I wake up and I think it must be 1899. In the age of the robber barons, in the age of the robber barons. Good morning. It is Monday morning on, at least here in the Pacific west coast of the U.S. And it is January something, maybe 8th, something like that. And yeah, it's 8th because in 2 days I'm playing in Olympia. And that's on the 10th. And the age of the robber barons never ended, as a very nice person who goes by the name of Fourth Dimensional Quasar commented, and this is very much the case, and this is my attraction to writing songs about things that happened in the past, because the past is only partly past, and yeah, and it's still happening. And in fact, the age of the robber barons, which is the second module on my history teaching aid, which is what these Monday morning missives are more or less focusing on. The second module covers basically the age of the robber barons and the early 20th century, which a lot of things happened in, as usual, in the world. And I learned from the last thing I did here, first of all, how to use the link that I said I was going to use, and also the importance of having a glass of water nearby, and also the fact that when people comment in the recorded version, those comments don't come up. So for people watching later, it's important for me to actually tell you what the comments are about when people say things, and people are very most welcome to say things, because I think that's more interesting that way. And then if it's something that I can respond to, then I'll respond to it. If it's a question, then of course that's really obviously something to respond to. And but actually I'm going to depart from the module a bit. It's not really departing from the module, but it's just, I'm going to sing a couple of songs that that will eventually make it into the second module, but aren't in there yet, because I just wrote them. and they're related to this period of time. So I thought I would do them here on this here show. Yeah, so let's see. I'll do one. Oh, after I look at these comments. So the comment, when I stop talking, the comments actually pop back up again. That is very nice. Let's see if it happens again. Oh no, it's only like once in a while. I don't know. But yeah, somebody, fourth dimensional quasar, commented on the destruction of the Amazon, which is very related to the age of the robber barons, for sure, because the robber barons were all about buying up land and then making as much money as possible off of it, or in many cases actually being given land. Yeah. So in the face of this situation in the late 19th century, in the United States, although it certainly was not unique to the United States, but in the U.S. and many other countries in Europe and Canada and elsewhere, in the industrializing world, there were at this point there were unions. It was not technically, if you tried to form a union, you were no longer going to be necessarily imprisoned for sedition, or most of the time. I mean, people in places like Britain were no longer, at this point in the late 19th century, they were no longer being deported for the crime of organizing a union. But the force brought down on organized labor or disorganized labor, either way, from the authorities was incredibly intense, and basically it was in practical terms, it was not legal. It was legal to form a union, but not possible. I mean, what is the term to use there? There's a term for that, I'm sure. It was on the books. It was legal, but if you actually tried to do it, it didn't. You quickly found that it was, for all effective purposes, not legal. Greetings from Australia to Paula, who says greetings from Australia, and greetings to Australia. And I think it's probably like 4 in the morning over there. When you time these broadcasts, you can never do it in a way that's good for everybody. So I always just kind of leave the Australians in awkward situations, because it's always some terrible time of the day there. But yeah, in Europe it's early evening, and in North America it's late morning or early afternoon. So, and South America as well. And then, of course, in much of the world, they just call it America, North and South America. And it's one continent. I didn't even know that. I always grew up learning it's 2 continents, but over in Europe, I believe you learn it's 1, and there's 6 continents in the world, right? Not 7? Is that right? I don't know. Probably doesn't matter, but it may have some kind of significance culturally. But anyway, back to the Gilded Age. Yeah, everyone here should invite their friends now. Yes, thank you, John. Please do. And because if you just share this broadcast, all 12 of you who are watching, or maybe there's more, I don't know, but if you share the broadcast, more people will find out about it. I've always wondered why Europe and Asia are considered separate, says Fourth Dimensional Quasar, and I always wondered that too, because it is one massive land mass separated by tectonic plates and stuff like that, but so is lots of other places separated by tectonic plates, and we don't call them separate continents. But these things are very much political in nature, I believe, and and also like Russia, of course, goes all the way out to the Pacific, and if you ever wondered how all of that massive amount of land went from being sort of Europe to Asia to Eurasia to whatever you want to call it, it was in the 19th century there was a huge settling going on of Russia by people from the west of Russia to the Asian regions, um, and and it was very much a sort of a settlement conquest kind of thing, much like what was happening at the same period in history in the Americas. And so it's yeah, interesting. I never really knew about that until I recently read a book called Owning the Earth, which is a fantastic book. And also in this book, they also talk about the period that I'm singing about here in this second module of the history history teaching aid here that I've designed, such as it is, and the at the same time as this expansion, this sort of settlement conquest of Russia, settlement conquest of North America was happening as well. It was being done in different ways in the U.S. At different times, and it was in some places the stolen land was being distributed by the settlers to the settlers in an equitable way, if you can call anything equitable after the land has been stolen. But it's one of those many contradictions of understanding U.S. history that we have to talk about these things. You're talking about, it does matter, I would say, what you do with the stolen land after you steal it. Of course, it would have been better not to steal it in the first place, but the fact is it was stolen, and then what happens to it afterwards? We now have 300 million people in this country. We're not all going to be going back to wherever we came from, but since we came from here. But like places like Ohio, when it was settled, it was distributed in an equitable way, where people could buy a plot of land, pay off the loan within 3 years, and then they'd be farming and having a place to live for the rest of their lives, and hand it on to their children and all that. It didn't go that way in many other places. And then by the late 19th century, once most all of the land in the freshly stolen parts of the U.S. out west had been essentially bought or taken or given away to rich people, then the speculation became rife, and then the inequality became intense, and actually things were so unequal in the late 19th century that you have to that's actually the last time in U.S. history when things were were more unequal than they are now. It was during the Gilded Age. It used to be that you had to talk about 1929. Things are more unequal now than at any time since 1929 was something you would hear on the radio when, on the news, when people would be talking about inequality. On the rare occasions they talked about that. But now they say, now suddenly, one day that kind of, the phrase shifted without any discussion, as far as I heard on NPR, and they started talking about how now it's more unequal than at any time since the late 19th century, since the Gilded Age, the age of the robber barons. And of course the response of the working class overwhelmingly was to organize in unions and try to fight back against this situation where these massively wealthy people were owning everything, buying everything, and then running industries and using stolen resources and exploiting workers at terribly low wages for very long hours. And so what people did was they organized, and they fought back. They organized unions, which was the new way of fighting back since the 1840s, when it became a popular concept. And before then there were other ways to fight back, which I mentioned in the last module, such as armed rebellions. But union organizing became the main way for the working class to try to fight back against their deplorable conditions of life in places like the United States and Britain and France and elsewhere. And so in the 1880s, there was a campaign for the 8-hour day, for the and the 8-hour day, of course, being not just that the workday should not be more than 8 hours, but that 8 hours should also be enough of a workday, 8 hours, 5 days a week, 40 hours with a weekend. That the 8-hour day in that way should be enough to actually feed a family on. That was the idea. And at the time it wasn't enough to feed a single person on, so people were working insane hours. And of course, women and men were both working. The idea of a family wage was just a joke for most of society. And in fact, at least I know in the 1840s, most of the factory workers were women. I think that started to change later in the century. But yeah, people organized, and in 1886 in Chicago, at a protest against long working hours, for better working conditions, 8-hour day, etc. The police opened fire at the crowd and killed people. And the following day, in 1886, on May 2nd, 1886, the same thing happened at a protest for the 8-hour day in Milwaukee, which was a major industrial city at the time. And the response of the labor movement in the U.S. At the time was to call for a May 1st to be commemorated, this day of the Haymarket Massacre, to be commemorated as International Workers' Day, May Day, May 1st. And so this tradition became adopted by pretty much the entire world. And oddly enough, a little aside here, which is probably something that was well known to people in the United States, or at least they would have noticed it, whether they knew the history, is that we do not have any kind of official labor celebration of May 1st. I mean, you may notice some things happening on May 1st, and in large part it's because of immigrants who come from countries where May 1st is International Workers' Day. But for many decades, you would barely find anything happening as far as celebrations of International Workers' Day. Although in the far left, like in groups like SDS and other groups in the 60s, celebrated it, but in the early 70s. But the official labor movement pretty much ignored May 1st after the Russian Revolution, when there was, I can't remember at what point, if it was right after or sometime after, but the tradition was changed so that American workers would not be marching on the same day as Russian workers, which I think actually tells you a lot about how powerful the authorities thought the idea was that everybody around the world would be marching around with red flags all at the same time. I think many people in some of the more privileged social democracies of Europe think of May Day as a big party, and it is, and that's fine. But of course, it's still, even in those places, it still has the celebratory nature of the party still has a very left-wing character, and you still see red flags all over the place. And at all but the most mainstream of the celebrations, there's a clear political nature to the party, even though it is essentially a party. And it's a really good party. and I sometimes have five. My record is 5 gigs on May 1st in Denmark. I think there was like 1 in Sweden and 4 in Denmark in one day. And incidentally, I am going back to Europe in the spring, so if anybody is listening from Europe and you want to organize a show, I'll be there. I'll be in Denmark on May 1st, although I do not have a gig booked, but we'll see about that. It'll change. So I just finished, I just kind of got this song into a form that it can be sung publicly about half an hour ago, so I don't know. We'll see how it goes. Started with a protest in the Gilded Age. Chicago, Illinois was the stage. Workers had gathered across the country to demand a living wage. First in Chicago, then in Milwaukee, the state of U.S. democracy was shown to the world with volleys of bullets from the police authorities. Word spread about what happened there across the country from Haymarket Square. Word spread across the oceans to just about everywhere that there'd now be a day when simultaneously on every continent, in every country, all the workers would march together for the world that shall be. The 1st of May, the 1st of May, International Workers' Day, the 1st of May, the 1st of May. Every year it's part of the mix from now to 1886 to stand against, divide and rule, the boss's favorite trick. The 1st of May, the 1st of May, International Workers' Day, the 1st of May, the 1st of May. From Chile up to Newfoundland, Galway to Georgia, hand in hand, for at least this one day. It's one big union grand. The 1st of May, the 1st of May, International Workers' Day, the 1st of May. The 1st of May. In the streets, in the parks, from the DRC to Denmark, it may not breathe a prairie fire, but it's such a beautiful spark. The 1st of May, the 1st of May, International Workers' Day, the 1st of May, the 1st of May, the 1st of May, the 1st of May, International Workers' Day, the 1st of May, the 1st of May. So where was I going with that? Oh yeah. So let's see. Do you got any? Hey y'all, bravo! Thank you very much. So the most radical militant labor unions in the industrialized world in the late 19th century, and particularly in the early 20th century, I would, as far as I know, were in the United States. And if anybody can correct me on that, then please feel free. But I believe that is the case, and and not only in the United States, but on the West Coast and of the United States. And the West Coast, ever since then, has had a reputation for being this sort of more progressive, interesting part of the country. Whether or not that's true, and for the most part, it's not. But this is let's if we just go on the assumption that I'm right in this statement, which is a very big statement to make because it's a big world out there. But it has been said by many historians, and well, of course don't believe it just because a historian says it, that the United States, and particularly the West Coast of the United States, had such militant labor tradition. However, the explanation which the historians give is a very sensible one. And I think on the face of it, it makes a lot of sense, especially if just if you know how people are now and in the past. I think it makes a lot of sense. And basically, in a nutshell, the United States was, and to some extent is, but especially at that time, was a country of, they called it a nation of immigrants, which is a very inaccurate term because it's a nation, it was a nation very much of disenfranchised indigenous people and a nation of slaves who had been forcibly brought here from Africa, and a nation of refugees, which made up most of the rest of the population. If they weren't indigenous or slaves, they were probably refugees or the descendants of refugees. But it's not fashionable here, and it was never fashionable, as far as I know, to refer to yourself as a refugee or to refer to your country as a country of refugees. So it was referred to, they talked about the U.S. as a nation of immigrants. Of course, there may be in some people's minds there's a thin line or maybe a thick line, I don't know, between the concept of refugee and immigrant. But an immigrant is somebody who goes to another country maybe for a whole variety of different possible reasons, looking for a job or marriage or just wanting to live somewhere else, or any number of, they like the weather, they don't like the weather at home, whatever, that's immigration. Being a refugee is better life. Being a refugee is when you leave because life at home is so dangerous or deplorably bad in conditions. You're hungry, you're starving, you're being politically persecuted, that kind of thing. There are pogroms, there's genocide going on, your ethnic group is being slaughtered, whatever it is, that's the kind of thing that causes people to become refugees. And by that definition, most of the Europeans who came to the United States were refugees. And that is certainly true of non-Europeans who also came to the United States. But many more of the people who came to the U.S. were, in fact, European refugees, not other refugees. And the reason for that is because we had a whites-only immigration policy, just like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and other settler colonial countries. We had a whites-only immigration policy. Now, how did we end up with so many people of color in the society? Even while we had a whites-only immigration policy, well, there are lots of reasons for that. For one thing, you could be born. If you were born here, you got citizenship. So that was pretty much the only avenue for citizenship for people of color. And then it was free. People could freely cross between the U.S. and Mexico. There was always a need, at least as far as the wealthy people were concerned, for cheap labor. And they had no problem with lots of people crossing the border at will, as long as they couldn't become citizens. So they wouldn't let them become citizens, but they were always guest workers, whether they were Mexican, Chinese, Japanese, or whoever. They were building the railroads, in the case of the Chinese and Japanese, or they were building the country, building buildings, building the infrastructure, building the highways. They were farming, but they were not allowed to be citizens. and unless they got born here. So eventually, if they stuck around long enough, over the generations, they become citizens because their kids will be born here. But so the guest workers who violated the law by staying, or who but it was never a welcoming place for people from other countries other than Europe, and even the European refugees were terribly discriminated against. Depending on who they were. Like, I mean, it was, this is something that people have tended to learn about in school, like the maybe, I guess, the idea that the new generations of white European refugees were treated badly, basically because they were new, So this was true of the Swedes who lived on garbage dumps in Chicago, and it was very much true of the Irish who came in massive numbers because they were escaping the twin horror of famine and terrible repression on the part of the British authorities. For 400 years, the Irish referred to each other as slaves, and half the country was killed or driven out when the British invaded, and then it has still never recovered its population since then. Before Britain invaded, there were 8 million people in Ireland. There's currently, still today, I believe, less than 5 million. This is also true of Peru, incidentally. But Peru, I believe, had many millions more than it has now. But back before the Spanish came. But so the U.S. got this reputation of being a nation of immigrants. It never was, but certainly it was a nation populated largely by people who were not born in the United States, and they were for the rich. Immigration was a wonderful thing. They loved it, and this is why it's such a divisive issue today within the Republican Party and other elements of the establishment. Of course, the establishment will try to paint themselves as one thing or another, to sell the whole thing to the population. So they'll say, "Oh, we love people, we love human rights, we want to welcome immigrants because this is an immigrant society," and all this. They'll say nice things about immigration. The reason why the rich like immigration is because it drives wages down. Of course, if wages are driven down by immigration, this is not just because of immigration. It's naturally, of course, going to happen when there's more people competing for more jobs. Then wages are going to tend towards going down. But of course, it's also a question of whether these immigrants are in unions or not. And of course, the labor movement was always subject to divide and rule tactics, as it still is. And the authorities, many people in positions of power tried hard to keep the unions from being some entities that would appeal to the broad mass of the working class by painting the unions as only representative of one group in the working class and not other groups. And then for to a large extent, the unions didn't need the help of the authorities to be discriminating against people, for example, people of color who were overwhelmingly not allowed into the union movement until the industrial workers of the world came into existence in 1905 and changed the face of everything. But sticking around with the late 19th century, I'll do another song which is related to this question I've just been talking about. Give us your huddled masses, yearning to be free. That's what it says on the Statue of Liberty, and here they come from the other side, across the southern border, across the Great Divide, and now they're told they should go away. But the statue in the harbor says stay. Give us here cold and hungry, let them come by land or sea. Let them all find solace in this land of refugees, escaping persecution, just trying to survive. And they worked as hard as Guatemalans soon as their ships arrived, and now they're told they should go away. But the statue in the harbor says stay. Give us here persecuted, but only if they're white. It doesn't say that on the statue that holds aloft the light. What did you think would happen in the lands you overthrew? Where should all the children go after the coup? And now they're told they should go away. But the statue in the harbor says stay. The statue in the harbor says stay. So in thank you. So in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, where the industrial workers of the world organized in the Lowell textile mills, where thousands and thousands of young women were dying at an average age of 26 because of the conditions that they worked in, breathing cotton dust that killed them at an average age of 26. And they organized against this. I mean, I don't even know what you call conditions of work that are that bad. But unfortunately, you don't have to go far to find similar conditions of work in the microchip factories in Indonesia, where women are dying at an average age of 26. Last I checked. But this is what was happening in Lowell, Massachusetts, in the textile factories in the early part of the 20th century, and it wasn't unusual at all. And yeah, they used to call them sweatshops, and of course they still do. And so people organized, and one of the famous examples of the efforts of the authorities to prevent the workers from organizing involved the authorities purposefully hiring workers from as many different language groups as possible. So it wasn't, of course that was easy to do because there was massive immigration at the time. But they purposefully went about making sure to hire women from every immigrant group to make it as difficult as possible for them to communicate with each other. And so when the strike committee in Lowell consisted of 52 people, and they needed to have such a large committee because there were 26 language groups at the factory, and so they had two workers from each language, and then they had a complicated system of translation that allowed people to ultimately be able to have meetings, which must have been hellacious to sit through. I mean, anybody who has attended a show or a lecture of somebody who is getting translated, live, it's interminable for anybody that actually, especially for people that don't need the translation, because for people that don't need it and speak both of the languages in question, then they're hearing everything twice, and then for everybody else it still takes twice as long. And somebody asks, what did I miss? And if you want to see what you missed, then you can watch the broadcast. It will be archived as soon as it's over. And so when the industrial workers of the world formed, among the many. I mean, they were a revolutionary union in many ways. For one thing, they organized women. For another thing, they organized people of color. And for another thing, women and people of color were organizers, and were not only organizers, but were in some leading positions in the union. Some of the most well-known labor people in history today, to the extent that anybody knows anything about labor history, they're going to know names like Emma Goldman and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and Mother Jones, Mary Jones, because these were prominent organizers at the time within the labor movement, and specifically with the industrial workers of the world, or propagandists or speakers, or in the case of Emma Goldman, I don't know, but certainly part of that whole effort, that whole struggle, which involved a lot of different roles for a lot of different people. And with people coming from all these different language groups, and there was a lot of the efforts at communication were sort of involved cartoons and songs and basically simple ways of communicating that didn't involve too much complex language that most people speaking English as a second language would not understand. So there was a real effort to communicate with lots of different ways, including lots of oral history, oral forms of communication, including lots of setting the songs of the Salvation Army singers outside of the Salvation Army, where they're trying to feed people and convert them to Christianity. At the same time, the Wobblies, the IWW members, would sing across the way from the Salvation Army, but they would change the words to the Christian songs to talk about union organizing. And one of the organizers for the IWW that became probably the most well-known labor organizer in U.S. history, which is not saying much because labor organizers are not well known generally, but that would be Joe Hill. And probably if people know who he is, the average person in the U.S. knows who he is, it's probably because they are old enough to have heard Joan Baez singing the song in the 60s. But who knows? There's other ways they could know about Joe Hill. The song I'm talking about is the one written by Earl Robinson and popularized, at least in the early, just before the middle of the 20th century, by Paul Robeson, but later much more popularized by Joan Baez. But I'm not going to sing that song. I'm just doing songs that I wrote about history, and this is a song I wrote for when it was the 100th anniversary of Joe Hill's execution in 2015. He was executed in 1915. Yola Hegland came from Sweden, which was very far from Eden. By the time he left, most of his family died. His sisters and his mother, his father and his brother, so with one remaining sibling at his side, he got a notion to sail across the ocean, where he heard the streets were paved with gold. Not long after his arrival, as he toiled for survival, he realized the bill of goods that he'd been sold. He got a whole lot wiser, became an organizer, and he organized with artistry and skill. He spoke up, raised his fist, got right on the blacklist. That's why he changed his name to Joe Hill. He heard that it was best if he headed to the West, where the industrial workers of the world were finding the solution for making revolution, with red songbook and red flag unfurled. 100 years ago, the bard with the Union card proved his music was too powerful, too strong. They couldn't stand the sound, they had to take him down. lest he organize the working class in song. Soon as he paid his dues, he tried hard to light the fuse, speaking, singing, writing lyrics and cartoons. He sent off the whole mess to the wobbly press, and they sang his songs as they fought the goons. He joined a singing movement that fought for improvement by abolishing wage slavery worldwide. He sang the wobbly line, beseeching workers to combine, learn from Mr. Blunt, the boss's line. 100 years ago, the bard, with the union card, proved his music was too powerful, too strong. They couldn't stand the sound, they had to take him down, lest he organize the working class in song. His life would be cut short by a kangaroo court, eager to determine one man's fate. Evidence was circumstantial, but that's inconsequential when you've become an enemy of the state. They put him up against the wall, that was all. They gunned him down in 1915. He took all the bullets he could take there by the Salt Lake for being the best bard they'd ever seen. 100 years ago, the bard with the union card proved his music was too powerful, too strong. They couldn't stand the sound, they had to take him down, lest he organize the working class in song. 100 years ago, the bard with the union card proved his music was too powerful, too strong. They couldn't stand the sound, they had to take him down, lest he organize the working class in song. Lest he organize the working class in song. And so then Joe Hill was executed in Sugar House Park in Salt Lake City in 1915, and the governor and the local authorities were so intent to execute this guy for for what he had supposedly done, that they ignored the President of the United States, which is kind of a big deal. And I believe also the Pope. I mean, there were really, really prominent people who were beseeching the governor of Utah not to execute Joe Hill. But he ignored them and executed him anyway. And the ostensible reason they were executing Joe Hill was because he was there in Salt Lake City with the IWW organizing workers, and he was shot one night. And the same night that he was shot, a storekeeper was also shot in Salt Lake City, which, at the time was a fairly unusual number of shootings, even for the United States. And but that's not evidence. That may be a strange coincidence, but it's not evidence that Joe Hill had anything to do with the storekeeper being shot, or that the storekeeper had anything to do with Joe Hill being shot. In any case, the storekeeper died and Joe Hill survived his shooting incident. And he didn't want to talk about what happened, and he didn't want to talk about any alibis or any of that kind of thing, because he was shot in a dispute involving a relationship, sexual relationship with a woman and another guy. And he didn't want to basically ruin this woman's life by talking about who she was, and we know this partly because the woman later did talk, I believe, decades later. But that's what was happening, and Joe Hill had some kind of faith in the U.S. justice system, perhaps, that because there was no evidence against him, that he'd be let out, and he had reason to believe this because At the time, the IWW was being persecuted by the authorities in a very big way, although the persecution increased dramatically a few years later. But there was a tremendous persecution going on against the IWW from authorities all over the country, and most of the time, and part of the persecution, other than, I mean, of course, it involved a lot of times killing union organizers in many different instances, hanging people like Frank Little under a bridge, and massacres in Everett, Washington, and Centralia, Washington. Later, there were many different incidents of nearly killing people by beating them nearly to death, deporting people out to the desert where they nearly died of thirst, all kinds of different tactics on the parts of the authorities. But one of the most popular tactics, other than the Billy Club, was false charges. They charge union officials and organizers with something totally scurrilous, just in order to tie up the union and their resources in the courts. So it was a victory even when the state would lose most of these cases that they brought against organizers, because they were so ridiculous. They would still tie up the resources of the union. And so Joe Hill had reason to believe he would be another one of those cases where they brought scurrilous charges against somebody and then they'd be dropped. But that's not what happened. Not what happened at all. And he was executed. And he wished to be cremated. And famously, he wanted his ashes to be distributed around every state in the Union. I believe he said every state in the Union except for Utah, because he wouldn't want to be caught dead in Utah, he said. He had quite a sense of humor even on death row. Look up at the sky, clouds about to burst. In the absence of the struggle, things tend to look the worst. I try to count my blessings, be glad that I'm here still, looking at the jar of ashes sitting on the windowsill. I walk past the rows of tents that line the avenue, just like the rows of tents here in 1932. Some things take a long time, I shiver in the chill, thinking of that jar of ashes sitting on the windowsill. I walk home and I wonder, will it ever happen again, that there might be the fighting spirit that there was back then? 'Cause things are worse now than they were back when he was killed, when he became a jar of ashes sitting on the windowsill. 2118, who knows how things might be? Will families live beneath the bridge in a century? Will the lives of fellow workers mean more than dollar bills, more than a jar of ashes sitting on the windowsill? I plunk notes upon the piano like he did long ago, somewhere here in Portland, somewhere near Skid Row. I'll sing a song for you then, until I sing my fill, looking at the jar of ashes sitting on the windowsill. My body, oh, if I could choose, I would to ashes it reduce, and let some merry breezes blow my dust to where some flowers grow. Perhaps some fading flower then would come to life and bloom again. This is my last and final will. Good luck to all of you. Joe Hill. Those last lines in the song are excerpts from his final will, which he wrote before he was executed. Haunting, thank you. So the IWW was such a threat to the United States authorities at the time that that it wasn't enough for them to just settle for local authorities arresting, beating, and sometimes killing organizers throughout the country, which was happening. That was not enough at the time when Joe Hill was executed in 1915. So the U.S. authorities stepped it up. They stepped up their campaign of terror against the organized labor movement in the form of an organization that they formed called the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And the FBI was formed in the wake of the First World War and in the wake of the destabilizing impact of the industrial workers of the world, which coincided with the First World War. The IWW opposed the First World War as a boss's war. They said it was that the working people should not be sent across the ocean to kill other working people in a war for the rich. And they had a lot of eloquent propaganda that made this point in many different ways, as did the labor movement throughout much of the world. In Scotland, they had a popular slogan, a bayonet is a weapon with a working man at either end. And in Ireland, James Connolly said, we shall fight for neither king nor Kaiser, but for Ireland. In Australia, workers, the voting public, the voting Australian voters voted against the draft twice before Australia sent troops into the war anyway. In the United States, they passed the Sedition Act, the Alien and Sedition Act, which was to basically make it illegal to speak out against the war. This was considered sedition, and was an imprisonable offense, and many people were imprisoned for years and years for speaking out against the war. And they were all considered to be German agents. That was the term they used for people who spoke against the war. But after jailing Eugene Victor Debs and many other people for opposing the war, they they decided that they needed to crack down on this anti-war movement, this labor movement, which at the time were the same thing. They needed to crack down on this movement harder. And the way they did that was by forming a national police force, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, which of course we don't, ostensibly we don't have a national police force here, but we do. It's called the FBI. We have many national police forces actually. Another is called ATF. But they formed the FBI, and they and the first thing the FBI was assigned to do was basically something called the Palmer Raids. Palmer was the director. They named it after him. The Palmer Raids, which involved raiding IWW union halls throughout the country and burning them to the ground. And they did this using a right-wing veterans group called the American Legion, which was the group that actually did the burning of the halls. It wasn't actually, the burning wasn't actually done by FBI agents themselves. It was in collaboration with the American Legion. But the FBI was helping to coordinate this whole thing. And they arrested almost the entire leadership of the organization and organized to deport tens of thousands of IWW members back to war-torn Europe. Of course, at the time, it was such an immigrant-led movement that I believe most or large minority, maybe a majority, of the IWW organizers and members were actually European refugees and immigrants. So ultimately, I think they actually ended up deporting 6,000 of the 20,000 that they rounded up. But the point was made, the Union was largely broken. And it continued to exist, and it continues to exist today. And in its current form, the IWW does great organizing all over many different countries, here in Portland, New York, in England, Wales. There's a lot of IWW activity in many different countries involving low-wage workers and community defense against Nazis and all kinds of different things. But which is all consistent with the community defense against Nazis, as well as the organizing workers, is all consistent with the kinds of things that the IWW was doing 100 years ago as well. It's not, these aren't new ideas. But back in the day, 100 years ago, it was a massive organization with millions of members and millions more supporters. And today it's much smaller. And my latest album is called Ballad of a Wobbly. I'm going to leave you with the title track of the album, One More Song, which is part of this module, module 2 of my musical history teaching aid. And yeah, in Germany there's WABs as well, and IWW members. And yeah, so I'll do this last song in this presentation. Each of the modules is like 10 or 15 songs, some a little more. Obviously, I'm not doing all the songs in each of these presentations, but this presentation is basically focusing on songs and the time period related to the second module of my history teaching aid, which you can find at davidrovics.com/history. And I'll do one more song, and I will be back next Monday to do this again. Monday morning, 10 a.m. Pacific time, and then it'll be archived afterwards for anybody who wants to watch later. And this is a song I wrote about the Palmer raids called Ballad of a Wobbly. Came to this country, left Scotland far behind, evicted from the Highlands, told to go and find a new life in America across the Atlantic Sea, where I joined the millions of other refugees who ended up at Ellis Island as the century began. The wretched of the earth from every foreign land. When I came to this country, broken and bereft, I quickly saw I'd have been no worse off if I'd never left. Such awful deprivations as I'd never had to face, borne by Swedes and Russians, Africans, and every other race. Millions of people trying not to end up dead from cholera or black lung or being clubbed on the head. When I came to this country to have something on my fork, it was obvious the first thing was to get out of New York. I learned to hop the freight trains, some other stiffs and I caught a westbound rattler to give Oregon a try. Signed up for the logging camps, became a timber beast. If I'd stayed there any longer, I'd have surely been deceased. When I came to this country, I worked the copper mines in Butte. I was a Gandhi dancer in Spokane in a Gandhi dancer suit. I heard the rebel girls speak one night in a railway yard. I joined the union right away and got my first red card. Became a hobo organizer for the one big union brand, preaching the wobbly gospel across this starving land. Came to this country, I soon enough lost track of the number of times I felt a billy club upon my back, or how many times I saw the tents with freezing kids working in the mines instead of living on the skids. How many times I heard the horrid crying from below of those trapped there in the dungeons with nowhere left to go. This country, it was a hopeful time of desperation. The red flags flew all across the nation, but when the war began in Europe, we refused to die and kill. We refused to fight a boss's war and serve the boss's will. That's when they got the Legion to burn down our union halls all across the land where there used to be 4 walls. When I came to this country, I had no great expectations, but I didn't think I'd end up back here awaiting deportation. On a steamship on the Hudson, I watched the sunset fade, with 20,000 others swept up in the Palmer raids. Counting myself lucky that I'm still alive, remembering the moment that I first arrived when I came to this country. When I came to this country. When I came to this country. That is the presentation for this week. Thank you all so much for listening. And somebody says that you've learned more from my music than from 12 years of public schooling. And that is exactly why I'm doing this, and why I, well, why I think that, why I wanted to do a history teaching aid through music, because I think you can learn a lot that way. And it's a whole different way of learning. The words, when sung, go to the emotional centers of the brain, and they affect you in a whole different way. And I think especially for introductory history lessons, songs are possibly the best form of education. And then for more detail, then books are really, really good, really essential, in fact. But for introductory stuff, I think songs are really, really good, and even for more advanced stuff. And I think that they should be used in schools a lot more. And as I mentioned last week, there are school systems in Sweden and in Germany that are using my songs as teaching aids, and also in the U.S. the Zinn Education Project, which is related to the Rethinking Schools initiative. They are also using my songs as teaching aids, which I've been doing for a long time, but then I thought I should organize them in a more organized kind of way as teaching aids. So I'll just show you one more thing before I go, and if anybody has any comments or questions or anything, or compliments like that last one who said that you've learned more from my music than from 12 years of schooling. The modules are great. I like that too. Come to Austria in the midterm future. I would love to come to Austria. I have never had a gig in Austria. I have been to Austria. I think Vienna is a tremendously beautiful city. I noticed when I was in Austria that the vast majority of the population, at least in Vienna, seems to speak fluent English. And I think that I should be playing in Austria on a regular basis, particularly since I play in neighboring Germany and Switzerland very frequently. So, please, you in Austria who wrote that message, if you want to organize a gig, I would love to do one. The basic deal for you or anybody else out there is that if you can come up, if you're in North America or in Europe, and your dates are flexible about when I come, and you can come up with $500 or the equivalent in whatever local currency, 400 euros. No, 500 euros. It's about 1-to-1, 400 pounds, something like that. $500, somewhere around there. If you can come up with that somehow or other through an organization, a union, activist group, a school, college, church, whatever, a bunch of friends who have jobs. However you do it, if you can come up with $500, then I know that as long as I can work out the dates in a way that they work with my schedule, I can be there. That goes for Austria as well. So I would love to do a gig in Austria. It requires somebody being able to have the wherewithal to cobble together a guarantee, most of which you'll probably get back from people coming in the door at the show who pay at the door. But you might lose some money. That's how it goes. I just caught that, I think, the 100th commemoration of Ginger Goodwin. Ginger Goodwin, I wrote a song about him, which is also in this module. I was in Cumberland years ago, where Ginger Goodwin was an organizer in the mines up there before he was shot for being a resistor to World War One, and which led to the Victoria General Strike of 1918. I I would love to be up in Cumberland for that, and it is exactly the same problem and or situation as I was just describing in Austria. If somebody in Cumberland can come up with $500, I can get there. Um, it's and the UK visit, and we're talking US dollars, not Canadian. The UK visit, I will be in the UK in early June. I'll be leaving. I'll be in. I'll be touring in Texas in late March. I'm available to go anywhere in the U.S. if somebody can come up with a decent enough gig. But where those gigs have happened, and so far in 2018, is Texas. I used to live in Texas. People may not realize that there's loads of progressives and wonderful people in Texas. Houston and Dallas are full of them. Whatever it is you hear about Texas, it's true, but it's not all true. It's a much more complex place than you think. There's 30 million people. 40% of them are of Mexican origin. It's a wonderful place, except for the weather. I hate the weather, but otherwise there's a lot of good things about Texas. And I'm looking forward to going back there. And in March it's beautiful. And it's beautiful now. I mean, the weather is amazing in the winter. But and then in mid-April, I'll be going to Europe. Probably start in Denmark. I'm not sure exactly, but I'll be definitely. I got gigs lined up for sure in Germany and England, Ireland, and I'm sure that there will be lots of gigs in Denmark, possibly Belgium. And I don't know. I don't know where else exactly. It depends on who responds and who is willing to organize stuff. And you know, part of the reason it works for me so much better in Europe is because they have institutions like unions and left political parties that have budgets and can afford to organize events. And it's not all about how many people are going to come pay at the door. But you know, here in the U.S. it's tougher, but because we don't have those institutions. But we do have some people who have jobs, and so if people want to organize a gig well enough, enough to do it, then you know, sometimes it involves spending a little of your own money to sponsor a visiting musician if you think it's worth doing. But that's basically the only way it works for me, because I don't get big enough crowds to make it work financially. Touring the U.S. I'm talking about. Used to work, doesn't work now. But that could change. It's up to you. And you, with a big U, with a capital Y. These are Joe Hill's ashes. These ashes contain some of Joe Hill's body, by the way. Local leftist music. It's disappearing. Oh, come back, come back. How do you make the messages come back? Let's see. If I press that button, will that make... good. Hey, show. Yeah, show them. Good. I'll see local. I'll see if the local leftist music cafe can organize something in the spring or early summer and contact you then. But I can only ask them. Show it again. No, show. Yeah. But I can only ask them being a patron rather than someone working there. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of things you could do potentially, Max. To organize a gig. That's one way to do it. But usually, actually, venues don't promote or pay. So basically, a venue is a place to host a show, but the organizer needs to be somebody other than the host. And I can explain it in great detail, but I won't, because if you go to davidrovics.com and click on the link on the main page that says how to organize a show, then you can read about how that works. But it's just telling a venue about an artist and asking them to book the artist is usually not the way it works. It can work that way if we're talking about a venue that has an institutional budget, like it's owned by a union or something like that. But otherwise, it doesn't work that way. And I would love to visit Brighton, but it's the same deal with I need somebody in Brighton to offer to organize a gig and come up with money. A great place to play in Brighton, there's a couple of them, but they don't pay, so it's that problem. My landlord doesn't accept apples for rent. He needs a lot of money every month, so I need paying gigs. And these ashes were sent to me by I think somebody who's listening now, right? And I really appreciate having them because I think because it makes me feel connected to history, and which I feel connected to anyway. I don't need ashes of a labor martyr to feel connected to history, but they're very nice to have, and I thought I'd show them to you. And I'm more of a younger person here. I'd love for you to come over to my part of England. And why did the messages disappear before I can read them? This is annoying. But I hear we're pretty conservative. There is no part of England that is conservative. All of England, every city in England has radicals in it. I don't know about every town, but every city does. And in England, the further north you go, the more radical people get in terms of working class radicalism, which is to say radicalism. But it would be tough to organize a gig, a well-attended gig in a conservative town like Dorset or something. But I mean, Billy Bragg lives around Dorset, I think. I mean, there's radicals everywhere, and it's just a matter of working with an organization or a bunch of other people who want to put something together. David, I'd love to hear Comandante Fidel if you have the time. I'm also from England and would love to catch you over here. Good, I will be there in June for sure. But I am not doing Comandante Fidel because this is because that is for another module, which is later in this series of musical history teaching aids. This was about the age of the robber barons and the early 20th century IWW, which was enough to cover in an hour, and now it's been an hour and 17 minutes, so I will be taking off, and thank you all so much for listening, and listen to the next I think that'll be in like the module number 14 or something, so and it's also on my latest album, Ballad of a Wobbly, which you can listen to for free on Bandcamp, and you can find that at my website, davidrovics.com. Thank you so much for listening, everybody out there, and please, after this is archived, and you can share the link, I think you can actually share the link now or anytime, but please share the link, please tell people about these broadcasts, and I'd love to have more people listening next time, and I'd love the numbers to increase every week, but that's probably just a pipe dream. But anyway, I like pipe dreams. And if you are in Olympia, Washington, I hope to see you on Wednesday at Traditions Cafe. And if you know anybody in Olympia, tell them I'm playing there in 2 days. Okay, take care, keep on keeping on. Hope to see you on the road and in the streets. Bye-bye. Although I don't know how to hang up. How do I hang up? Bye-bye. But maybe I'm never leaving. I don't even know how to... Oh, do I just press the X? All I can say is... What? Raquel. ... Well, that's a good statement, I think. I like dots. Okay, bye everybody.